Keanu Reeves never imagined that the most unpredictable moment of his life would come while sitting in a KFC, hunched over a tray of chicken strips, tried to avoid the stares of fans who'd spotted him walking in. He'd come here for the anonymity, a break from the endless photo shoots, interviews, and never-ending rush of being who he was. He found a corner booth, away from the hustle and bustle. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he actually managed to feel a tiny bit normal. There was nothing extravagant about this place, just a simple, low-key fast food joint on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, filled with families and people stopping in for a quick bite. Keanu wasn't used to being able to sit in peace, not without someone whispering about him or trying to sneak a photo. But right then, it felt like a brief escape. As he picked up his soda, taking a sip, he heard the door jingle open. The usual flood of customers didn't catch his attention, but the small figure that followed behind them did. A little girl, no older than 7, stood just inside the door, her tiny hands clutching a stuffed bunny. She wasn't with anyone, no parents, no older sibling holding her hand. She just stood there, looking around, almost as if she were lost. Keanu couldn't help but watch her. There was something in the way she held herself that told him she was on her own. The cashier, a young guy probably in his 20s, noticed her too. His face twitched slightly, as if confused by the sight of a child standing alone in the middle of a fast food restaurant. He walked over to her. "Hey there, kid," he said, leaning down, his tone a little sharp. "Are you lost?" The girl didn't answer right away. She just stood there, clutching her stuffed animal tighter. A small, almost imperceptible tear slid down her cheek, though she didn't wipe it away. She opened her mouth, hesitating, as if she were unsure whether she should speak at all. Finally, she whispered, so softly that Keanu could barely hear it. "I'm hungry. Can you help me?" The cashier blinked, looking from the little girl to the kitchen, then back to her, his expression showing clear annoyance. "Help you with what?" he asked. "We can't just give away food, kid. You gotta pay for it, you know?" The girl's shoulders sagged as she took a small step back, eyes lowering to the floor. Keanu could feel the awkwardness in the air. Others in the restaurant had started to notice the exchange. Some were muttering, glancing from the cashier to the little girl, but nobody moved, nobody did anything. The atmosphere was heavy with the quiet, unspoken question of whether anyone would intervene. Then, Keanu couldn't just sit there anymore. He stood up slowly, walked over to the counter, and cleared his throat. The cashier shot him a quick glance, but didn't acknowledge him right away. Keanu looked at the little girl, her eyes still locked on the ground, the stuffed bunny hanging loosely from her tiny hands. He crouched down so he was at level with her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "What's your name?" The girl looked up, her face streaked with the remnants of tears, and after a long pause, she whispered, "Mia, Mia." Keanu repeated gently, offering her a smile. "Are you okay? Do you need something to eat?" Mia's lip quivered slightly, but she nodded. Her voice barely broke through a quiet, almost embarrassed admission. "I haven't eaten all day," she said, her eyes darting from Keanu to the cashier, to the menu above her head, as if unsure of what to do. Keanu's heart twisted. He couldn't just let this go. He looked up at the cashier, who still seemed unsure of how to react. "I'll take care of her order," Keanu said, his tone firm but not angry. "Whatever she wants. Don't worry about it." The cashier didn't argue, but he didn't exactly look thrilled. Mia's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, a small smile cracked on her face. She hesitated, glancing back at the menu. "Can I have some chicken?" she asked quietly, as if worried her request was too much. Keanu nodded, his voice gentle. "Anything else?" She shook her head, clinging to her stuffed bunny. "Just that." As the cashier went off to ring up the order, Keanu turned back to Mia. He crouched down again, his eyes meeting hers. "You know, it's okay to ask for help. You don't ever have to feel like you're alone." His words seemed to settle on her for a moment, like a weight being lifted. He could see her beginning to trust, just a little. Mia's voice barely broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly, his heart aching for her. "What are you sorry for?" he asked softly. She shook her head, a few more tears slipping down her cheek. "I didn't mean to make anyone mad. I didn't have a choice," she murmured. The words hung in the air, and Keanu realized then that this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. This was something much deeper, a cry for help that went far beyond an empty stomach. And as Mia's order was placed on the counter, something inside Keanu snapped. He couldn't just walk away from this. He wasn't about to let her leave alone. Not like this. As the girl slowly approached the counter to grab her food, Keanu couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. There was something in the way she moved, hesitant, almost afraid of being a burden, that tugged at him. He watched her tiny hands wrap around the tray, her face still twisted in uncertainty, as if she were waiting for someone to tell her she wasn't allowed to have it. He thought about how many people had walked past her in that very moment, how many had looked at her and dismissed her as just another lonely child. He didn't know what had led her here, to this moment, to this KFC of all places, but he knew he couldn't let her slip through the cracks. He stepped forward, following her, though she didn't seem to notice him as she hesitantly made her way to an empty table in the corner of the restaurant. Keanu stood there, watching her, wondering if anyone else had seen what was happening or if they were all too consumed with their own lives to care about this child in front of them. He noticed the way she ate her food, slowly, carefully, as if she were savoring every bite, but also trying not to draw attention to herself. It was then that Keanu noticed something else. The girl wasn't just hungry. She was starving. There was a desperation in her actions, in the way she picked up each piece of chicken, the way her eyes darted nervously around the restaurant, as though she expected someone to come and take it away from her at any moment. It didn't sit right with him, not at all. This wasn't just about food. There was a story here, a story that no one in the restaurant was even attempting to understand. Keanu wasn't the type of person to pry into someone else's business, but something inside him snapped as he watched the girl, completely unaware that he was still standing there, taking it all in. Without thinking, he walked over to her table, sitting down across from her. "Hey, Mia," he said gently, trying not to startle her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Her hand instinctively reached for her stuffed bunny, clutching it tightly to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Keanu softened, tried to put her at ease. "You don't have to be scared. I just wanted to check in on you, make sure everything's okay." The girl stared at him for a moment before she looked down at her food, still not speaking. The silence between them was thick, but Keanu didn't rush her. He let her take her time, let her decide when or if she wanted to speak. But when she finally did, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't have anywhere to go," she said, her voice cracking as the words slipped out. I didn't know where to go. I'm scared." Keanu felt his stomach tighten. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he was at a loss. He had no idea how to respond to something like that. How do you offer comfort to a 7-year-old who is telling you she has nowhere to go? "What do you mean, Mia?" he asked softly, his voice breaking slightly. "Where are your parents? Who are you here with?" Mia's eyes darted to the floor, and she shook her head. I don't have anyone. My mom, Her voice trailed off, and she stopped herself from saying more. Keanu could see the struggle in her eyes, the way her emotions were bubbling just beneath the surface. He knew she was holding back, too afraid to reveal too much. But he also knew that this was the moment, the tipping point where she would either open up or shut him out forever. "Hey, it's okay," Keanu said, his voice softer now, more reassuring. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I just want to help. You don't have to go through this alone." The words seemed to reach her, and for the first time, Mia's walls began to crack. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears, and it was as if she had finally decided she couldn't carry the weight of it all by herself anymore. "My mom, she told me to go away," Mia said, her voice trembling. She told me to go to the store, get food, but I didn't have any money. And when I came back, she wasn't there anymore. I've been walking around for hours, trying to find her." Keanu's heart sank as the weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. He tried to hide the shock in his face, tried to keep it together, but he was failing. He could feel the anger building inside of him, bubbling up at the thought of what this little girl had been through. "Mia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You should never have been put in that situation. You deserve better. But I want you to know something. There are people who care about you, people who will help you. You don't have to be scared anymore. I'll help you." Mia wiped at her eyes, sniffling as she looked up at him. "You're not going to leave me, are you?" she asked, her voice small and vulnerable. Keanu's heart broke. He reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "No, Mia, I won't leave you. I promise. You're not alone." The moment hung in the air, charged with raw emotion. Keanu could feel the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders, the magnitude of the situation beginning to sink in. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't just let Mia go back out into the world on her own, not after everything she had just told him. She needed someone to protect her, to make sure she was safe. And as the minutes ticked by, the reality of what he had to do became clearer. Keanu stood up and walked over to the cashier. "I need you to call the police," he said, his voice firm. "This little girl needs help." The cashier, who had been watching the entire interaction with a mix of disbelief and uncertainty, finally nodded. Keanu could see the hesitation in his eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. Mia wasn't going anywhere until someone with the authority to help her showed up. Keanu returned to the table, sitting back down across from Mia. "Everything's going to be okay," he said, trying to reassure her as best as he could. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change both their lives forever. The air in the KFC was thick with anticipation, as Keanu sat across from Mia, trying his best to maintain a calm facade for her. It was a fight to hide his anger and disbelief over what had just been revealed. The moment Mia had opened up to him, he felt a pit form in his stomach, a wave of helplessness crashing over him. He had seen people go through rough times, but hearing it from someone so young, so small, it hit differently. Keanu could feel the entire restaurant shifting around them, people murmuring among themselves, the tension building in the room like the pressure in a brewing storm. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, unsure of what to do or whether they should get involved. It wasn't often that someone like Keanu found himself in a situation like this, but he couldn't walk away. A few minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Keanu kept his eyes on Mia, watching the way she played with the stuffed bunny, trying to distract herself from the mess she was in. She still looked scared, vulnerable, as if she was waiting for someone to tell her that everything was going to be okay. But even Keanu couldn't offer her that kind of certainty. As much as he wanted to, he knew this wasn't going to be solved over a plate of fried chicken. There were bigger things at play here, things far beyond a simple meal or a kind word. Keanu's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on Mia. He knew the call was important, but not as important as making sure she was all right in that moment. The people who had overheard their conversation were beginning to react. Some were discreetly reaching for their phones, no doubt planning to post something about the interaction, while others sat back in their seats, looking between Keanu and the little girl. The whispers around them grew louder, but Keanu didn't care about any of it. He wasn't interested in the opinions of strangers. His mind was consumed with Mia's situation. The cashier had already made the call to the authorities, but Keanu wasn't sure what kind of help they would provide. Would they show up in time? Would they even care enough to do something? A sick feeling lingered in his gut. He had been through enough public situations where people, including himself, were left to deal with the aftermath of a messy encounter. A celebrity helping a little girl wasn't something the world would forget, but would it be enough to make sure she got the help she needed? He glanced at Mia again, her eyes wide and distant, and he realized that in this moment, it wasn't about the attention or the headlines. It was about her. Mia, still clutching her stuffed bunny like it was the only thing she had left, spoke up again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go back there," she said, looking up at Keanu, her words filled with fear and doubt. "I don't want to go back to the place I came from. She's not nice to me. I don't know why she just said I had to leave. She told me not to come back. I don't know where to go." Keanu's heart shattered. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say that could ease her pain. His thoughts raced as he considered her words. He could feel the frustration building, the deep, suffocating feeling that came with knowing there was little he could do in that moment beyond offering her comfort. What could he do? He wasn't a social worker, wasn't trained to handle situations like this. He didn't know the steps to take to make sure she would be okay in the long run. But what he did know, what he had learned over the years, was that there was a difference between doing nothing and doing something. Right now, doing something meant staying with her, keeping her safe, showing her that someone cared. He wouldn't leave her. Not now. Not when she needed him most. Mia, Keanu said gently, his voice unwavering. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You don't have to go back to where you came from. You're safe now. We'll figure this out together, okay? Mia nodded slowly, but Keanu could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't convinced. She didn't believe him yet, and he didn't blame her. Why would she? She had already been let down once by the person she was supposed to trust. Her mother. The one person she was supposed to turn to when she was scared or hungry or lost. And now she was sitting across from a stranger in a KFC, unsure of where her life was heading next. Keanu could feel the weight of his promise pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what kind of help was coming from the police or how long it would take them to arrive. He glanced back at the front of the restaurant, where he could see the concerned faces of the other patrons. Some were still watching him, some pretending they weren't. He could feel the weight of the stares, but none of that mattered anymore. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about what people thought. Then, just as Keanu was about to say something else to reassure Mia, the door swung open, and two uniformed officers walked in. They were tall, with serious expressions, and immediately scanned the room. One of them locked eyes with Keanu, who stood up and waved them over. The officers approached the table, their gazes shifting between Keanu and the little girl. Mia, one of the officers asked, kneeling down to her level. The girl didn't speak at first, her eyes darting between the officer and Keanu, unsure of who to trust. Keanu could see the fear still in her, and it hit him all over again just how much this little girl had already been through. The officer, sensing her hesitation, spoke in a softer tone. It's okay, sweetheart. We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name? Mia finally spoke up, her voice shaky. Mia, we're going to make sure you're safe, okay? The officer reassured her. Do you know where your mom is? Mia's lips trembled, and she shook her head. No, she told me to leave. She's not nice. Keanu watched as the officers exchanged a look, one of them glancing over at him with a silent acknowledgement. He knew there was no easy fix to this. There were no quick solutions. But at least Mia wasn't alone anymore. At least now, she had someone to help her. Keanu didn't know what would come next, whether the officers would find her mother, or if she would be placed somewhere safer. But he knew that the first step had been taken. She wasn't just another sad story. She was Mia, a little girl with a future still to be determined, and Keanu had done what he could to make sure that future wasn't left to chance. Thank you, Keanu said quietly to the officers as they took Mia gently by the hand and led her toward the door. The restaurant was eerily quiet now, and Keanu realized that everyone who had been watching had quietly turned away. They had witnessed something that most would rather pretend didn't happen, but he couldn't forget it. And neither would Mia. Keanu sat back down at the table, his hands still trembling slightly as he watched the officers lead Mia out of the restaurant. The little girl's small hand gripped one of the officers, her other clutching the stuffed bunny tightly to her chest, as if it were the last connection to the world she once knew. Keanu's stomach churned with a mixture of relief and dread. The officers seemed calm, efficient, but he couldn't shake the thought that there was so much more to this story, that Mia's life had been left in pieces long before she had wandered into this KFC. It didn't feel like enough, not yet. It wasn't just about getting her out of the restaurant. It was about what happened next. As Mia and the officers made their way to the door, Keanu stood up, his feet moving almost instinctively, as if he could stop them from leaving. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to do so, but he needed to know that Mia was going to be all right, needed to be sure that the authorities would do something, that the situation wasn't just going to end here with a promise. He didn't know what he expected the officers to say, but as they reached the door, he walked toward them. "Excuse me," Keanu called out, his voice firm but careful not to alarm anyone. The officers paused, turning to face him. One of them, the taller of the two, looked at Keanu with a neutral expression, but nodded in acknowledgement. Yes, sir. Keanu's mind raced as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had to ask. He couldn't let this go without making sure Mia had every chance to be heard. Is she going to be okay? I mean, what happens now? Where will she go? The officer gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. We're taking her to a shelter for now. We'll contact Child Protective Services, and we'll investigate further. He paused, glancing at Mia, who was still holding her bunny, looking back at Keanu over her shoulder. She'll be safe. That's what matters right now. Keanu nodded, but his heart didn't settle. It didn't feel like enough. It couldn't be enough. Mia was just a child, and whatever shelter she was sent to wasn't going to erase the pain she had experienced. He didn't know why it felt like this was unfinished, like he was standing at the edge of a cliff waiting for something to happen, something more. Before he could say anything else, the door opened again. A woman rushed in, breathless, her face flushed with panic. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a worn coat, her eyes scanning the room as she darted between the tables. Keanu noticed her immediately. There was something in the way she moved, the hurried desperation that filled her every step. She didn't seem to notice him at first. Her gaze locked on the officers and the small girl they were guiding out the door. Wait, wait. The woman's voice broke the silence like a whip, and for a moment, the entire restaurant froze. Her eyes locked on Mia, and Keanu's stomach dropped. He could feel the shift in the air, the tension spiraling out of control as the woman stepped toward the door. Mia, she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. Mia, please. Don't leave me. Keanu's mind raced. The woman's face was contorted with fear and pleading, and for a split second, Keanu thought maybe Mia's mother had arrived. Maybe this was a reunion. Maybe it was something positive. But as he looked at the officer, he saw no relief in the man's eyes. Instead, there was something darker, something more complicated. The officer stepped in front of Mia and the woman, his hand raised in a gesture to stop her. Ma'am, I'm afraid you need to calm down. This isn't. Mia, please, the woman cried again, her voice cracking. I'm your mother. Please don't go. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to push you away. I was just... She stopped herself, her voice faltering as if she couldn't find the right words. She reached out to Mia, but the officers quickly moved to block her. Keanu's heart dropped as the truth hit him like a freight train. This wasn't a mother coming to rescue her daughter. This was something else entirely. Mia's mother didn't look like a woman who had been wronged or misjudged. She looked like a woman who was panicking, desperate to fix a mistake she had already made. And Mia wasn't looking back at her, wasn't reaching out to her like most children would do. Mia wasn't reacting like a child who had just been reunited with the person who was supposed to love her. Mia was scared. Mia, please listen to me, the woman cried, her voice growing more frantic by the second. I was just upset. I didn't mean to hurt you. I need you. Please don't leave me. She stepped forward, trying to push past the officers, but they didn't budge. Keanu could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as the situation escalated. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Mia's face. The little girl stood frozen, her back stiff, her bunny still gripped tightly in her arms, but her gaze never wavered from the floor. She didn't look up at her mother. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring, as if the entire world had suddenly gone quiet. The officer, his voice calm but firm, turned to the woman. Ma'am, this isn't helping. You need to step back. You're not in a position to speak to her right now. The woman's face twisted with a mix of confusion and anger. What are you talking about? She's my daughter. You can't take her away from me. Keanu's chest tightened as he realized what was happening. This wasn't a moment of reconciliation. This wasn't a mother showing up to apologize and make things right. The situation was far more complicated than that, and it was clear that Mia wasn't going to be going back to her mother, at least not without someone else stepping in. Keanu stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. She's been through enough, he said, his gaze shifting between the woman and the officers. You need to let her go, and you need to get help. The woman's eyes shifted to Keanu, recognition flickering in them for just a moment before it turned into something else. A mix of resentment and desperation. Who the hell are you? She spat. Mind your own business. You don't know anything about us. Keanu didn't flinch. He wasn't there for a fight. He was there to make sure Mia wasn't just handed back to someone who didn't care about her safety, someone who wasn't going to help her heal. I know enough, he said calmly, his eyes unwavering. And you need help, too. This isn't just about you or her. This is about what's best for her. Mia finally lifted her eyes. It wasn't much, just a small glance toward her mother. But Keanu could see the quiet resolution in her face. She wasn't going back. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The woman hesitated, her face contorting with the weight of her failed attempts. And for a moment, the restaurant was silent again. And then, without another word, she slumped, her shoulders sagging in defeat as the officers gently escorted her out of the building. Keanu stood there for a moment, watching the door swing close behind them. Mia wasn't going back to that life. Not if he could help it. He had no idea where she would go from here, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let her slip through the cracks again. The restaurant had fallen into a heavy silence after the confrontation. Keanu stood by the door for a few moments longer, his eyes locked on the spot where Mia had stood, where her presence had left a mark on the space, a mark he would carry with him for a long time. The officers had taken her, and the woman, her mother, had been escorted out, her defiant words still echoing faintly in Keanu's mind. He could feel the weight of the moment in his chest, a kind of raw finality that had settled over him. The situation had spiraled into something far more complex than he had anticipated when he first saw Mia enter the restaurant. He had hoped, even briefly believed, that he could offer her some small reprieve, a moment of safety and comfort. But the reality of her life, the life she had been running from, was darker, more tangled than he had known. Keanu didn't know if he had done the right thing. He didn't know if taking Mia's side had been the right call, or if he had just interfered in a situation that wasn't his to fix. But as he stood there, watching the officers drive off with Mia, something inside him told him that for better or worse, he had made the choice he needed to make. And whatever happened next, Mia wouldn't be alone in this anymore. He had promised her that. He glanced at the other patrons in the restaurant, most of whom were still glued to their seats, unsure of what to do next. Some had taken out their phones, likely to snap pictures of the scene they had just witnessed. Others just sat in silence, taking it all in. The young cashier who had been the first to engage with Mia earlier was standing off to the side, looking visibly shaken, his face pale as he stared at the door the officers had just walked through. He wasn't sure how to feel about it all. He was just a kid, really. Just a guy trying to make it through his shift without too much drama. He had done his part by calling the police, but that didn't seem like enough. His gaze met Keanu's, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both been witnesses to something bigger than either of them had expected. Keanu walked up to the counter, the weight of the situation still heavy on his mind. The cashier was wiping down the counter nervously, avoiding Keanu's eyes. Keanu leaned in slightly, his voice low but calm. "Hey, you did the right thing calling the police," he said quietly. The cashier looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and relief. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded, still processing everything. Keanu gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You don't always know what to do in these kinds of situations, but you did the best you could. That's what matters." The cashier gave a small, shaky exhale and ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know what to make of it. I mean, the little girl seemed so lost, you know? It felt like I should have done more." Keanu shook his head. "You did what you could. That's all anyone can do in a situation like that." There was a long pause between them, and Keanu could tell the young man was still struggling with the weight of the events. It wasn't just that he had witnessed something so jarring, it was the realization that people could be so unaware of the struggles others face, especially those too young to understand what was happening around them. The cashier finally gave a small nod, his face softening a little. "Thanks. I guess I just wasn't ready for something like that." Keanu looked around the restaurant. The place was now quiet, the usual background noise of chatter and the hum of the fryer machines replaced by the faint sound of distant conversations. It felt like everyone had just witnessed something, but no one knew how to process it. Keanu realized something in that moment. People had a habit of standing back, observing, never getting involved when things got complicated. It was easier to turn away than it was to face the mess. But the mess was where change happened, where lives were shaped, even broken ones. Keanu turned back to the cashier, his voice quieter now. You can't fix everything. You can't save everyone. But when you see something like that, you make a choice, whether you're ready for it or not. The cashier looked up at him, as if processing the weight of his words. Keanu felt that familiar sense of purpose again, the feeling that had guided him through years of public scrutiny, of navigating through the noise. It wasn't always about making the headlines or receiving praise. Sometimes it was just about being present, about making sure people knew they weren't invisible, even when the world seemed too big and indifferent. Maybe you're right, the cashier said slowly, his voice quieter now. Maybe it's just about being there when it matters. Keanu nodded. Exactly. It's not always about fixing the whole thing. Sometimes it's just about making sure someone knows they're not alone. They stood there for a moment longer, both lost in thought, before the silence was broken by the sound of the restaurant door opening again. A man walked in, his eyes immediately locking on Keanu, and for a moment, the tension of the past hour seemed to lift just slightly. It was clear that the man recognized Keanu, and he seemed surprised, perhaps even a little flustered. Keanu smiled politely, not wanting to make the moment awkward. The man nodded, still staring at him. Sorry to interrupt, he said, clearly unsure how to continue. I just wanted to say, well, I saw what you did in here with that little girl. It was something. I don't think anyone expected that, but I appreciate it. You stepped in when most people wouldn't have. Keanu felt a wave of discomfort at the compliment. He wasn't interested in being recognized for helping Mia. That wasn't why he had done it. He simply couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer, especially when they were so young. But the man's words, even though they were brief, made Keanu realize something. The world might not always be kind, and people might not always act when they should, but when someone did step in, when they chose to take the harder path, others noticed. They remembered. Keanu nodded back at the man, his gaze calm but resolute. I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done. It's just the right thing to do. The man gave a small smile, still standing awkwardly near the door. Maybe, but you didn't have to do anything. And I think that's what matters. Keanu didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the counter, his mind replaying the events of the last hour. The story wasn't finished, not yet, but it already changed something inside him. Something inside the cashier, too. And maybe, just maybe, Mia would remember that moment, remember that there were people who cared. Even if it was just one person, even if it was just Keanu Reeves in a KFC on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. And that Keanu thought was enough.